Hello guys, this is Study Documentaries and today I want to tell you about that of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, the father of communist Cuba, who was a thorn in America's side for nearly half a century, died Friday at the age of 19. The passing of the bearded, pistol-packing, cigar-chomping Comandante was announced by Cuban state TV late Friday. He died at 10:29 p.m. and is expected to be cremated Saturday morning, officials said. The revolutionary leader and former president had been in failing health for the past decade, and as recently as April said in an interview, he knew his time was fast approaching. Cuba's Fidel Castro, who defied United States for 50 years, dies at 19. Former President Fidel Castro, who led a rebel army to improbable victory in Cuba, embraced Soviet-style communism and defied the power of 10 United States presidents during his half-century rule, has died at age 19. With a shaking voice, President Raul Castro said on state television that his older brother died at 10:29 p.m. Friday. He ended the announcement by shouting the revolutionary slogan, "Toward victory always." Castro's reign over the island nation, 90 miles (145 kilometers) from Florida, was marked by the United States-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The bearded revolutionary, who survived a crippling United States trade embargo as well as dozens, possibly hundreds, of assassination plots, died 10 years after ill health forced him to hand power over to Raul. Castro overcame imprisonment at the hands of dictator Fulgencio Batista, exile in Mexico, and a disastrous start to his rebellion before triumphantly riding into Havana in January 1959 to become, at age 32, the youngest leader in Latin America. For decades, he served as an inspiration and source of support revolutionaries from Latin America to Africa. His commitment to socialism was unwavering, though his power finally began to fade in middle 2006 when a gastrointestinal ailment forced him to hand over the presidency to Raul in 2008, provisionally at first and then permanently. His defiant image lingered long after he gave up his trademark Cohiba cigars for health reasons and his tall frame grew stood. Socialism or death remained Castro's rallying cry even as Western-style democracy swept the globe and other communist regimes in China and Vietnam embraced capitalism, leaving this island of 11 million people an economically crippled Marxist curiosity. He survived long enough to see Raul Castro negotiate an opening with United States President Barack Obama on December 17, 2014, when Washington and Havana announced they would move to restore diplomatic ties for the first time since they were severed in 1961. He cautiously blessed the historic deal with his lifelong enemy in a letter published after a month-long silence. Obama made a historic visit to Havana in March 2016. Carlos Rodriguez, 15, was sitting in Havana's Miramar neighborhood when he heard that Fidel Castro had died. Fidel, he said, slapping his head in shock. That's not what I was expecting. one always thought that he would last forever. It doesn't seem true. It's a tragedy, said 22-year-old nurse Diane Montalvo. We all grew up with him. I feel really hurt by the news that we just heard. But the news cheered the community of Cuban exiles in Florida who had fled Castro's government. Thousands gathered in the streets in Miami's Little Havana to cheer and wave Cuban flags. Fidel Castro Ruz was born 13 August 1926 in eastern Cuba's sugar country, where his Spanish immigrant father worked, first recruiting labor for United States sugar companies and later built up a prosperous plantation of his own. Castro attended Jesuit schools, then the University of Havana, where he received law and social science degrees. His life as a rebel began in 1953 with a reckless attack on Moncada military barracks in the eastern city of Santiago. Most of his comrades were killed and Fidel and his brother Raul went to prison. Fidel turned his trial defense into a manifesto that he smuggled out of jail, famously declaring, "History will absolve me." Freed under a pardon, Castro fled to Mexico and organized a rebel band that returned in 1956, sailing across the Gulf of Mexico to Cuba on a yacht named Granma. After losing most of his group in a bungled landing, he rallied support in Cuba's eastern Sierra Maestra mountains. 3 years later, tens of thousands spilled into the streets of Havana to celebrate Batista's downfall and catch a glimpse of Castro as his rebel caravan arrived in the capital on 8th of January 1959. The United States was among the first formally recognize his government, cautiously trusting Castro's early assurances he merely wanted to restore democracy, not install socialism. Within months, Castro was imposing radical economic reforms. Members of the old government went before summary courts and at least 582 were shot by firing squads over 2 years. Independent newspapers were closed and in early years homosexuals were herded into camps for re-education. In 1964, Castro acknowledged holding 15,000 political prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled, including Castro's daughter Alina Fernandez Revuelta and his younger sister Juana. Still, the revolution thrilled millions in Cuba and across Latin America who saw it as an example of how the seemingly arrogant Yankees could be defied. And many on the island were happy to see the seizure of property of the landed class, the expulsion of American gangsters, and the closure of their casinos. Castro's speeches, lasting up to 6 hours, became the soundtrack of Cuban life, and his 269-minute speech to the United Nations General Assembly in 1960 set the world body's record for length that still stood more than 5 decades later. As Castro moved into the Soviet bloc, Washington began working to oust him, cutting United States purchases of sugar, the island's economic mainstay. Castro in turn confiscated $1 billion in United States assets. The American government imposed a trade embargo banning virtually all United States exports to the island except for food and medicine, and it severed diplomatic ties on 3 of January 1961. On April 16th of that year, Castro declared his revolution to be socialist, and the next day, about 1,400 Cuban exiles stormed the beach at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's south coast, but the CIA-backed invasion failed. The debacle forced the United States to give up on the idea of invading Cuba, but that didn't stop Washington and Castro's exiled enemies from trying to do him in. By Cuban count, he was the target of more than 630 assassination plots by militant Cuban exiles or the United States government. The biggest crisis of the Cold War between Washington and Moscow exploded on October 22, 1962, when President John F. Kennedy announced there were Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba and imposed a naval blockade of the island. Humankind held its breath, and after a tense week of diplomacy, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev removed them. Never had the world felt so close to nuclear war. Castro cobbled revolutionary groups together into the new Cuban Communist Party with him as first secretary. Labor unions lost the right to strike. The Catholic Church and other religious institutions were harassed. Neighborhood revolutionary defense committees kept an eye on everyone. Castro exported revolution to Latin American countries in the 1960s and dispatched Cuban troops to Africa to fight Western-backed regimes in the 1970s. Over the decades, he sent Cuban doctors abroad to tend to the poor and gave sanctuary to fugitive Black Panther leaders from the United States. But the collapse of the Soviet bloc ended billions in preferential trade and subsidies for Cuba, sending its economy into a tailspin. Castro briefly experimented with an opening to foreign capitalists and limited private enterprise. As the end of the Cold War eased global tensions, many Latin American and European countries re-established relations with Cuba. In January 1998, Pope John Paul II visited a nation that had been officially atheist until the early 1990s. Aided by a tourism boom, the economy slowly recovered and Castro steadily reasserted government control, stifling much of the limited free enterprise tolerated during harder times. As flamboyant as he was in public, Castro tried to lead a discreet, private life. He and his first wife, Mirta Diaz-Balart, had one son before divorcing in 1956. Then, for more than 4 decades, Castro had a relationship with Dalia Soto del Valle. They had 5 sons together and were said to have married quietly in 1980. By the time Castro resigned 49 years after his triumphant arrival in Havana, he was the world's longest ruling head of government aside from monarchs. In retirement, Castro voiced unwavering support as Raúl slowly but deliberately enacted sweeping changes to the Marxist system he had built. His longevity allowed the younger brother to consolidate control, perhaps lengthening the revolution well past both men's lives. In February 2013, Raúl announced that he would retire as president in 2018 and named newly minted Vice President Miguel Díaz-Canel as his successor. "I will be 90 years old soon," Castro said at an April 2016 Communist Party Congress, where he made his most extensive public appearance in years. Soon I will be like all the others. The time will come for all of us, but the ideas of the Cuban communists will remain as proof that on this planet, if one works with fervor and dignity, they can produce the material and cultural goods that human beings need and that need to be fought for without ever giving up. Cuba's government announced that Castro's ashes would be interred on December 4 in the eastern city of Santiago, that was a birthplace of his revolution. That will follow more than a week of honors, including a nearly nationwide caravan retracing in reverse his tour from Santiago to Havana with the triumph of the revolution in 1959. In that part of the video, I want to tell you about Castro and communism in Cuba. Meanwhile, an example of communist tactics was being unfolded in Cuba within 90 miles of the United States' southeastern shoreline. Early in 1959, after battling for several years, Fidel Castro succeeded in overthrowing the government of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Mindful of Batista's cruel record of repression, the United States government and the American public in general welcomed Castro's rise to power as a victory for democracy. American sympathy rapidly evaporated, however, when Premier Castro began to act and sound like a communist dictator. He failed to hold the free elections he had promised the Cuban people. He put to death hundreds of his former political enemies in hasty trials intended more as propaganda than as judicial proceedings. Then he proceeded to fill Cuba's jails once more with political critics, including many of Castro's former comrades, anti-communist labor leaders, and other veteran opponents of the Batista regime. The press was placed under strict censorship. Foreign-owned property was expropriated arbitrarily without fair compensation, and in many cases without any compensation at all. Only the communists emerged unscathed from Castro's repressive and vindictive actions. As his internal dictatorship hardened, Castro began increasingly to denounce the United States and to seek support from the communist bloc nations. In the face of rising provocations, the Eisenhower administration at first adopted a policy of patient waiting. During the summer of 1960, however, American policy stiffened. The United States placed a temporary embargo on the purchase of Cuban sugar and urged the 21-nation Organization of American States to condemn Cuba's actions. The Organization of American States, while it did not directly criticize the Castro regime on this occasion, did condemn communist interference in the Western Hemisphere. Another international gathering held later in 1960 seemed to sum up the hopeful and disturbing aspects of the world scene. Meeting in New York, the United Nations General Assembly admitted 16 new nations, all but one from the African continent, a reflection of the rapid post-war movement of formerly colonial peoples to full independence and nationhood. In a speech to the United Nations delegates, President Eisenhower asked other nations to join the United States in providing increased aid to developing areas generally and the new African nations in particular. He also pledged that the United States would continue to seek a workable program of world disarmament based on an effective system of inspection and control. Prior to the General Assembly session, world concern over the mounting arms race had been heightened by man's conquest of space, a development which in more tranquil times would have been a source only of admiration and pride. The launching of the first Soviet space satellite in October 1957 and the first American satellite in January 1958, followed by many others, demonstrated that both countries how had rockets powerful enough to hurl atomic and hydrogen bombs into the heart of an enemy country thousands of miles away. In the absence of a foolproof arms inspection system, there was always the danger that, accidentally or otherwise, a push-button war might break out which could destroy millions of lives in a single blinding instant. World opinion was therefore shocked and disheartened when Premier Khrushchev told the United Nations General Assembly in belligerent tones that the Soviet Union would not accept inspection and control in the initial stages of disarmament agreement. Soviet leaders knew that disarmament without inspection was unacceptable to the democratic nations, since it would give dangerous advantage to a closed society like the Soviet Union, which could violate its disarmament pledge with little chance of being found out, whereas violations within a democracy would have high chance of being discovered and publicized. In the last part of that video, I want to tell you about Communist Party of Cuba. The Communist Party of Cuba is the political party that ruled in Republic of Cuba, although others exist. It is a communist party of the Marxist-Leninist model. The Cuban constitution ascribes the role of the party to be the leading force of society and of the state. Since April 2011, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba has been Raúl Castro, the president of Cuba, younger brother of the previous first secretary and president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, who died on 25 of November 2016. And the second secretary has been Jose Ramon Machado Ventura. Compared with other ruling communist parties such as the Communist Party of Vietnam, the Communist Party of China, and Lao People's Revolutionary Party, the Communist Party of Cuba retains a stricter adherence to the tradition of Marxism, Leninism, and the traditional Soviet model. The Cuban Party is more deeply committed to the concept of socialism than other ruling parties and has been more reluctant in engaging in market reforms, though it has been forced to accept some market measures in its economy due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the resultant loss of economic subsidies. The Communist Party of Cuba has favored supporting revolutions abroad and was active in assisting the ELN in Colombia, the FMLN in El Salvador, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and Maurice Bishop's New Jewel movement in Grenada. Their most significant international role was in Angola, where the Cuban direction of a joint Angolan-Soviet-Cuban force that was involved in the Battle of Culito Cuaneval. This led to the withdrawal of intervening forces and, in the following peace agreement, the independence of Namibia from South African rule. Despite the end of the Cold War, the party maintains a policy of sending thousands of Cuban doctors, agricultural technicians, and other professionals to other countries throughout the developing world. More recently, the party has sought to support left-wing leaders such as Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia. Raul Castro is campaigning to renew Cuba's socialist economy through incorporating new exchange and distribution systems that have been traditionally seen as market-oriented. This has led to some speculation that Cuba may transition towards a model more similar to that of China. In that part of video, we want to tell you about Castro's revolution begins. In July 1953, Fidel Castro led about 120 men in an attack on the Moncada army barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed. Castro was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison, and many of his men were killed. The United States backed Batista, looking to improve his authoritarian image, subsequently released Castro in 1955 as part of general amnesty. Castro ended up in Mexico, where he met fellow revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara and plotted his return. The following year, Fidel Castro and 81 other men sailed on the yacht Granma to the eastern coast of Cuba, where government forces immediately ambushed them. The estimated 18 survivors, including Castro, his brother Raul, and Guevara, fled deep into the Sierra Maestra Mountains in southeastern Cuba with virtually no weapons or supplies. According to Castro, the revolutionaries started reorganizing with only 2 rifles, but by early 1957 they were already attracting recruits and winning small battles against rural guard patrols. We would take out the man in front, attack the center, and then ambush the rear when it started retreating. In the terrain we would choose in, Castro said in his spoken autobiography. In 1958, Batista tried to snuff out the uprising with a massive offensive, complete with Air Force bombers and naval offshore units. The guerrillas held their ground, launched a counterattack, and wrested control from Batista on January 1, 1959. Fidel Castro arrived in Havana a week later and soon took over as Prime Minister. At the same time, revolutionary tribunals began trying and executing members of the old regime for alleged war crimes. Castro's rule. In 1960, Castro nationalized all United States-owned businesses, including oil refineries, factories, and casinos. This prompted United States to end diplomatic relations and impose a trade embargo that still stands today. Meanwhile, in April 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and funded by the CIA landed near the Bay of Pigs with the intent of overthrowing Castro. Their plans ended in disaster, however, partially because a first wave of bombers missed their targets and the second strike was called off. Ultimately, more than 100 exiles were killed and nearly everyone else was captured. In December 1962, Fidel Castro freed them in exchange for medical supplies and baby food worth about $52 million. Fidel Castro publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist in late 1961. By that time, Cuba was becoming increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union for economic and military support. In October 1962, the United States discovered that the nuclear missiles had been stationed there, just 19 miles from Florida, setting off fears of World War III. After a 13-day standoff, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the nukes against the wishes of Castro, who was left out of negotiations. In return, United States President John F. Kennedy publicly consented not to re-invade Cuba and privately consented to take American nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Cuban life under Castro. After taking power, Castro abolished legal discrimination, brought electricity to countryside, provided for full employment and advanced the causes of education and health care, in part by building new schools and medical facilities. But he also closed down opposition newspapers, jailed thousands of political opponents, and made no move toward elections. Moreover, he limited the amount of land a person could own, abolished private business, and presided over housing and consumer goods shortages. With political and economic options so limited, hundreds of thousands of Cubans, including vast numbers of professionals and technicians, left Cuba, often for the United States. From 1960s to the 1980s, Fidel Castro supplied military and financial aid to various leftist guerrilla movements in Latin America and Africa. Nonetheless, relations with many countries, with the notable exception of the United States, began to normalize. Cuba's economy foundered when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, and the United States expanded sanctions even further. Yet Castro, who by this time had switched his title from Prime Minister to President, found new trading partners and was able to cling to power until 2006, when he temporarily gave control of the government to Raul after undergoing emergency intestinal surgery. 2 years later, in 2008, he permanently resigned. In 2015, United States and Cuban officials announced they had agreed to terms on normalization of relations between the two nations, with mutual embassies and diplomatic missions opening in each country. Fidel Castro died on 25 of November 2016 at the age of 90. His death was announced on the state television and later confirmed by his brother Raul. Castro will be laid to rest in the city of Santiago de Cuba. Rebel army to improbable victory in Cuba, embraced Soviet-style communism, and defied the power of 10 United States presidents during his half-century rule, has died at age 90. With a shaking voice, President Raul Castro said on state television that his older brother died at 10:29 p.m. Friday. He ended the announcement by shouting the revolutionary slogan, "Toward victory always." Castro's reign over the island nation 90 miles 145 kilometers from Florida was marked by the United States-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The bearded revolutionary who survived a crippling United States trade embargo as well as dozens, possibly hundreds, of assassination plots died 10 years after ill health forced him to hand power over to Raul Castro, Cuban exiles in Florida who had fled Castro's government. Thousands gathered in the streets in Miami's Little Havana to cheer and wave Cuban flags. Fidel Castro Ruz was born 13 August 1926 in eastern Cuba's sugar country, where his Spanish immigrant father worked, first recruiting labor for United States sugar companies and later built up a prosperous plantation of his own. Castro attended Jesuit schools, then the University of Havana, where he received law and social science degrees. His life as a rebel began in 1953 with a reckless attack on Moncada military barracks in the eastern city of Santiago. Most of his comrades were killed and Fidel and his brother Raul went to prison. Fidel turned his trial defense into a manifesto that he smuggled out of jail, famously declaring, "History will absolve me." Freed under a pardon, Castro fled to Mexico and organized a really crippled Marxist curiosity. He survived long enough to see Raul Castro negotiate an opening with United States President Barack Obama on December 17, 2014, when Washington and Havana announced they would move to restore diplomatic ties for the first time since they were severed in 1961. He cautiously blessed the historic deal with his lifelong enemy in a letter published after a month-long silence. Obama made a historic visit to Havana in March 2016. Carlos Rodriguez, 15, was sitting in Havana's Miramar neighborhood when he heard that Fidel Castro had died. Fidel, he said, slapping his head in shock. "That's not what I was expecting. One always thought that he would last forever. It doesn't seem true." "It's a tragedy," said 22-year-old nurse Diane Montalvo. "We all grew up with him. I feel really hurt by the news that we just heard." But the news cheered the community of Cuba. Hello guys, this is Study Documentaries and today I want to tell you about that of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, the father of communist Cuba, who was a thorn in America's side for nearly half a century, died Friday at the age of 90. The passing of the bearded, pistol-packing, cigar-chomping Comandante was announced by Cuban state TV late Friday. He died at 10:29 p.m. and is expected to be cremated Saturday morning, officials said. The revolutionary leader and former president had been in failing health for the past decade, and as recently as April said in an interview, he knew his time was fast approaching. Cuba's Fidel Castro, who defied United States for 50 years, dies at 19. Former President Fidel Castro, who later overcame imprisonment at the hands of dictator Fulgencio Batista, exile in Mexico, and a disastrous start to his rebellion before triumphantly riding into Havana in January 1959 to become, at age 32, the youngest leader in Latin America. For decades, he served as an inspiration and source of support revolutionaries from Latin America to Africa. His commitment to socialism was unwavering, though his power finally began to fade in mid-2006 when a gastrointestinal ailment forced him to hand over the presidency to Raul in 2008, provisionally at first and then permanently. His defiant image lingered long after he gave up his trademark Cohiba cigars for health reasons and his tall frame grew stood. Socialism or death remained Castro's rallying cry even as Western-style democracy swept the globe and other communist regimes in China and Vietnam embraced capitalism, leaving this island of 11 million people an economical